Monte Cassino, Italy, February 12, 1944. Lieutenant General Mark Wayne Clark sits in his 5th Army command post, staring at a request that makes his stomach turn. New Zealand General Bernard Freyberg wants to bomb the ancient Benedictine Abbey, crowning Monte Cassino, the 1,500-year-old monastery that stands between Allied forces and Rome. Intelligence reports suggest German troops might be using it as an observation post. Freyberg insists the bombing is a military necessity. But Clark knows something Freyberg doesn't, something that tears at his conscience with every passing minute. Inside that monastery, huddled in the cold stone corridors, are over 800 Italian civilian refugees, families from the surrounding countryside who fled there seeking sanctuary, trusting that both sides would honor the sacred building's neutrality. Women holding babies, elderly men too frail to run further, children who've already witnessed horrors no child should see. If Clark authorizes this bombing, he will kill them all. The bombs will not distinguish between German soldiers and Italian mothers. The rubble will not care about children's screams. This is the moment where military necessity collides with human mercy, where a general must choose between winning a battle and saving innocent lives. Clark refuses. He explicitly orders that the abbey must not be bombed, that civilian lives inside must be protected, that this 1,500-year-old repository of Western civilization must be spared. His decision will be overruled within days by higher command. The abbey will be destroyed, and 230 Italian civilians will die in the rubble. But Clark's initial refusal, his moment of choosing mercy over military expediency, set in motion a complex legacy that would shape 3 generations of Italian families in ways no one could have predicted. By the time the Battle of Monte Cassino ended in May 1944, over 55,000 Allied soldiers and 20,000 German soldiers had been killed or wounded. The strategic bombing of civilian areas throughout Italy had already claimed tens of thousands of Italian civilian lives. Yet Clark's documented opposition to bombing the abbey, his explicit concern for civilian refugees, his attempt to protect the innocent, even when overruled, became a story that Italian families would tell their children and grandchildren, a narrative of mercy attempted even in the chaos of total war. How does one general's decision to show mercy, even when overruled, ripple across decades? What happens to the families who survived because someone tried to protect them, and to the descendants of those who died when that protection failed? And how does a single act of attempted humanity, in the midst of industrial-scale violence, change how entire communities remember war, process trauma, and build their identities across 3 generations? To understand the hidden price of Mark Clark's mercy and the intergenerational impact it created, we must begin in the 1920s, when Clark was a young officer learning his craft in an army, trying to process the lessons of World War I. Born in 1896 in upstate New York to a military family, Clark seemed destined for army life from childhood. His father had served in the Spanish-American War. Young Mark absorbed military culture like a second language, excelling at West Point, where he graduated in 1917, just in time to join American forces heading to Europe for the Great War. He was wounded by shrapnel in France, receiving the Distinguished Service Cross, and learning firsthand what modern industrial warfare did to human bodies. But more importantly for our story, he witnessed what total war did to civilian populations. The devastation of French and Belgian towns, the refugees streaming away from combat zones, the arbitrary cruelty of artillery that killed combatants and civilians indiscriminately, all of this shaped Clark's understanding that modern war created moral complexities previous generations of soldiers hadn't faced. Between the wars, Clark rose through peacetime ranks, doing the unglamorous work of training and administration. He studied at the Army War College, where curriculum increasingly focused on the problem of civilians in future conflicts. The Geneva Conventions of 1929 had attempted to create legal frameworks protecting non-combatants, but everyone knew these were aspirational rather than enforceable. Military theorists debated whether future wars would be limited conflicts between armies or total wars consuming entire societies. Clark, reading these debates and remembering French refugees, seems to have developed a personal conviction that even in total war, professional soldiers had obligations to protect civilians when possible, not from naive idealism, but from a pragmatic understanding that how armies treated civilians shaped post-war outcomes. By 1943, Clark commanded the U.S. Fifth Army in Italy, leading the brutal campaign up the Italian peninsula against determined German resistance. Italy presented unique challenges. Unlike France, which would be liberated, or Germany, which would be defeated and occupied, Italy was technically a co-belligerent after its September 1943 armistice with the Allies. Italian civilians were neither enemies nor entirely friends. They had suffered under fascist rule, endured German occupation after the armistice, and now found themselves trapped in a combat zone as Allied and German forces fought across their homeland. Clark's army was officially liberating Italy, but liberation through high-explosive bombardment looks remarkably similar to destruction from the ground level. The Fifth Army had already fought through Sicily and up through southern Italy by early 1944, experiencing firsthand the tensions of conducting modern warfare in densely populated areas. Monte Cassino became the focal point of the Italian campaign in late 1943 and early 1944. The ancient abbey, founded in 529 AD by Saint Benedict, stood atop a steep hill dominating the Liri Valley, the only viable route to Rome. German forces, under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's command, had built formidable defensive lines across the valley. The abbey itself sat at the center of the Gustav Line, Germany's main defensive position. The strategic importance was obvious. Whoever controlled Monte Cassino controlled the approach to Rome, but the abbey complicated everything. Kesselring, a Catholic himself, had promised the Vatican that German forces would not use the monastery for military purposes. He established a 300-meter exclusion zone around the abbey, stationed military police at the gates to enforce it, and even helped evacuate some of the abbey's priceless manuscripts and artwork to Rome for safekeeping. The Germans built their defensive positions on the hillsides around the monastery, not inside it. Whether this was purely for propaganda purposes or reflected some residual respect for sacred space is debatable, but the result was clear. The abbey itself contained no German troops, only Italian civilian refugees who had fled there believing both sides would respect its neutrality. By early February 1944, over 800 civilians sheltered in the abbey. They came from towns and villages throughout the surrounding region, places with names like Cassino, Piedimonte, San Vittore, small communities that had existed for centuries and were now being pulverized by artillery and aerial bombardment. The refugees included whole families who brought nothing but the clothes on their backs, elderly priests and monks who had spent their lives in the abbey, children separated from parents in the chaos, wounded civilians who couldn't be evacuated further. The abbey's monks, led by Abbot Gregorio di Amare, tried to maintain some semblance of order and dignity. They shared their limited food supplies. They organized sleeping areas in the cold stone corridors. They prayed constantly, Catholic prayers for deliverance that seemed increasingly futile as the sounds of battle grew louder each day. Many of the refugees were women, as younger men had either been conscripted into military service or were in hiding to avoid conscription. These women huddled with their children in the darkness, trying to explain why the walls shook, why the explosions kept getting closer, why nobody came to take them somewhere safe. Some had already lost family members to the fighting. Others had no idea if their husbands or sons were alive or dead. The psychological stress of this existence, trapped in a medieval monastery while modern war raged outside, was immense. Children developed a kind of shell shock, becoming unnaturally quiet or crying inconsolably. Adults oscillated between hope that the abbey's sacred status would protect them and despair that they had made a terrible mistake taking refuge there. Allied intelligence about German use of the abbey was contradictory and unreliable. Some reports insisted German troops were using it as an observation post and command center. Others stated definitively that no German military activity occurred within the exclusion zone. The truth was complicated. Germans certainly used positions near the abbey, and observers on the hillsides could see Allied movements throughout the valley. Whether any Germans ever entered the abbey itself remains disputed to this day. What's certain is that by mid-February 1944, the Allied offensive had stalled. 3 major assaults had failed with heavy casualties. General Freyberg, commanding the New Zealand Corps tasked with the next assault, became convinced that taking Monte Cassino required first destroying the abbey. He believed, or claimed to believe, that German troops inside the building were directing fire onto his advancing troops. Whether Freyberg genuinely believed this, or saw the abbey as a convenient scapegoat for previous failures, is unknowable, but he made his request formal and insistent. Bomb the abbey. The decision reached Clark's desk on February 12, 1944. The historical record, including Clark's own memoirs and contemporary documents, is clear about his initial response. He refused. Clark's reasoning was both humanitarian and practical. He had seen intelligence reports indicating that civilians were sheltering in the Abbey. He understood that bombing would kill those civilians. He also believed, correctly as it turned out, that destroying the Abbey would actually create better defensive positions for German forces, as rubble makes excellent fortifications. Clark's opposition was not naive pacifism, but informed military judgment combined with ethical concern. He believed the attack would be both morally wrong and tactically counterproductive. For nearly 48 hours, Clark held firm against mounting pressure. But military hierarchies rarely favor the humanitarian choice when higher commanders disagree. General Harold Alexander, commanding the Allied armies in Italy, overruled Clark. Alexander's reasoning was political as much as military. Freyberg, as a Commonwealth commander, had significant political backing. Refusing his request might create inter-Allied tensions. Moreover, Alexander was under pressure from Churchill and the combined chiefs of staff to show progress in Italy. The campaign had already cost far more time and casualties than anticipated. If bombing the Abbey might help break the stalemate, the lives of Italian civilians became an acceptable cost. On February 15, 1944, waves of American B-17 and B-25 bombers dropped over 1,100 tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs on Monte Cassino Abbey. The bombing lasted 3.5 hours. The 1,500-year-old monastery, one of the most important sites in Christian history, was reduced to rubble. The bombs killed 230 Italian civilians sheltering inside. Another 200 were wounded, many grievously. Some died quickly, crushed by collapsing stone walls or incinerated by direct hits. Others died slowly, trapped in rubble, calling for help that couldn't come as the bombing continued. Children died holding their mothers' hands. Elderly monks died praying in the chapel. Families who had survived years of war died together in the space of minutes. The survivors, traumatized beyond measure, had to crawl through the rubble to escape, seeing the bodies of people they'd lived beside for weeks, understanding that their faith in the sanctity of the Abbey had been catastrophically misplaced. Abbot Diamare, who survived, would later write heart-wrenching accounts of that day, describing how he tried to comfort the dying, how he blessed bodies he couldn't identify, how the sounds of the wounded screaming under rubble haunted him for the rest of his life. The military outcome was exactly as Clark had predicted. The bombing not only failed to help the Allied assault, but actually made the German defensive positions stronger. German paratroopers moved into the rubble immediately after the bombing, using the broken walls and collapsed stones as ready-made fortifications far superior to anything they'd had before. The battle for Monte Cassino would continue for another 3 months, costing thousands more lives on both sides, before Polish troops finally captured the ruins on May 18, 1944. The tactical benefit of the bombing was zero. The cost in civilian lives and cultural heritage was catastrophic. The cost in psychological and cultural trauma to Italian families would echo for generations. In the immediate aftermath, survivors scattered throughout the region, carrying with them not just physical wounds, but deep psychological scars. But they also carried something else: stories. Stories about how the American general had tried to protect them, how he had refused the order to bomb, how he had been overruled by higher command. These stories spread through Italian communities with remarkable speed and consistency. Refugees who made it to other towns told everyone they met about General Clark's mercy, about how he had tried to save them even though he failed. This narrative became embedded in local memory in central Italy, passed from survivors to their children, becoming part of family histories and community identity. The truth was more complex than the stories admitted. Clark had been overruled, but he hadn't resigned in protest or made a public stand. He had followed orders once his superiors decided, as military officers do, but for Italian families processing catastrophic trauma, the distinction between Clark trying to protect them and ultimately failing was meaningful. It meant that at least someone in command had seen them as human beings worth protecting, rather than as acceptable collateral damage. This recognition of their humanity, even in failure, provided a psychological anchor that shaped how they understood their experience and how they rebuilt their lives afterward. The first generation, those who survived the bombing, carried complex feelings about Americans for the rest of their lives. On one hand, American bombs had killed their families and destroyed their sanctuary. On the other hand, an American general had tried to stop it. This complexity prevented the kind of total resentment and hatred that might otherwise have developed. When American forces eventually drove the Germans north and began the process of liberation and reconstruction, many Italian civilians in the Monte Cassino region were predisposed to see individual Americans as potentially decent people caught in a terrible system rather than as uniformly evil destroyers. This psychological nuance facilitated post-war cooperation and reconciliation in ways that had lasting political and cultural implications. The second generation, children of survivors and children born shortly after the war, grew up with family stories about Monte Cassino that emphasized moral complexity rather than simple victimhood. They were told about the grandfather who died in the bombing, but also about the American general who tried to prevent it. This narrative framework helped them develop more sophisticated understandings of war and responsibility. Many second-generation Italian families in the Monte Cassino region became actively involved in post-war peace movements, memorial organizations, and Italian-American cultural exchanges, motivated by family histories that emphasized the importance of individual mercy even within violent systems. They didn't excuse the bombing or minimize its horror, but they carried forward the story of Clark's refusal as evidence that even in war, moral choices matter, and individuals can resist even when they ultimately fail. The third generation, grandchildren of survivors now living in the 21st century, have inherited these family narratives and built upon them in unexpected ways. Many have become historians, educators, and peace activists explicitly motivated by their family's Monte Cassino experiences. They've researched the bombing extensively, written books and articles, created museum exhibitions, and organized commemorations that bring together Italian survivors' descendants, American veterans' families, and German soldiers' families. These third-generation activities represent a form of meaning-making, an attempt to find purpose in ancestral trauma by using it to teach contemporary audiences about the costs of war and the importance of protecting civilians. Researchers studying intergenerational trauma transmission have found that how traumatic stories are told within families significantly impacts descendants' psychological outcomes. Families that tell stories emphasizing total victimhood and unmitigated evil often produce descendants with higher rates of anxiety, depression, and difficulty trusting others. Families that tell stories acknowledging moral complexity, including moments of attempted mercy even in horrific situations, tend to produce descendants with better psychological resilience and more sophisticated moral reasoning. The Monte Cassino families who preserved stories of Clark's attempted mercy inadvertently engaged in a form of narrative resilience that protected subsequent generations from some of the worst psychological effects of inherited trauma. The cultural legacy of Clark's mercy attempt extended beyond individual families to shape broader Italian-American relations. After the war, as Italy rebuilt and eventually became a key U.S. ally during the Cold War, the stories of American generals who had tried to protect Italian civilians provided cultural touchstones that facilitated alliance building. Italian politicians and cultural leaders could point to figures like Clark as evidence that Americans were fundamentally decent people who valued Italian lives and heritage, even when military imperatives created terrible outcomes. This narrative, accurate or not in all its details, served important diplomatic and cultural functions, helping to build the strong Italian-American relationship that characterized the post-war period. Clark himself lived until 1984, long enough to see some of these intergenerational impacts. In post-war years, he maintained relationships with Italian officials and periodically visited Italy. Accounts from these visits describe Italian civilians, including Monte Cassino survivors, approaching him to thank him for trying to protect the abbey, for caring about civilian lives. These encounters deeply affected Clark, who carried guilt about the bombing for the rest of his life, despite having opposed it. The recognition from Italian families that his mercy attempt mattered, even in failure, provided some measure of redemption and complicated peace for a man who had made countless life-and-death decisions during his military career. The physical reconstruction of Monte Cassino Abbey, completed in 1964, became a symbol of reconciliation and resilience that incorporated the mercy narrative into its meaning. The rebuilt abbey stands today as a monument not just to religious faith, but to the human capacity to rebuild after catastrophic destruction. The story of Clark's refusal is told to visitors as part of the bombing narrative, framing it within a larger story about how individuals within violent systems can still make moral choices, even when those choices don't prevent tragedy. This framing has influenced how subsequent generations think about individual moral responsibility within institutional violence, providing a more nuanced understanding than simple narratives of good versus evil allow. The hidden price of Clark's mercy was that it created expectations and narratives that shaped 3 generations of Italian families' understanding of American character and of war itself. These families couldn't fully hate Americans because they knew an American general had tried to protect them. They couldn't fully trust institutional promises of protection because those promises had failed. They developed a kind of tragic wisdom, understanding that good intentions aren't enough, that individual morality can be overwhelmed by institutional imperatives, but that attempting mercy still matters even when it fails. This wisdom became a family inheritance, passed from survivors to children to grandchildren, shaping how each generation engaged with questions of war, peace, justice, and reconciliation. If your family has connections to World War II, whether as soldiers, civilians, refugees, or observers, the stories you've inherited shape how you understand conflict and morality today. The narratives our families tell us about moments of mercy and cruelty in wartime become part of our own moral frameworks, influencing how we think about contemporary conflicts and our responsibilities within them. Please share your family's war stories in the comments below, not to glorify or condemn, but to preserve these complex human experiences that teach us about the real costs and occasional graces of war. If this exploration of how one general's attempted mercy echoed across 3 generations resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more deep examinations of the hidden human stories behind major historical events, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss upcoming episodes exploring similar themes from other conflicts and perspectives, because understanding the full human dimensions of war, including moments of mercy that failed but still mattered, makes us wiser about the choices we face today. Thank you for watching.